Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Mugdha Lele, and I am your host for today's talk in the Only One Theme talk series. This is the second wave that we have initiated, and today is the fourth talk in this second wave. So today's topic is setting up patent cell, and our speaker for today is Dr. Premnath V. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Premnath. Dr. Premnath is a scientist at the Polymer Science and Engineering Division at NCL, and he is the founder director for Venture Center. He is a technology developer, innovation and incubation manager, startup mentor, and a co-founder of two medtech startups. He has provided leadership for teams that have won national awards for technology development, intellectual property management, and business incubation. Dr. Premnath is a chemical engineer by training and an alumnus of MIT in the US, IIT-Bombay Distinguished Alumnus Award he has got in 2022, and has been a Chevening Technology Enterprise Scholar in Cambridge, UK. With this brief introduction, welcome Dr. Premnath to this session and handing over to you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just get started. Can you see my screen, Mugdha?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, and you can hear me clearly also.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining in. Today's topic is about setting up a patent cell and running it. And what I propose to do is also just share my learnings from setting up the IP group at NCL and some of the insights that we have learned over the time, the last decade or so. More, maybe 15, 16 years, and also share this especially with other people who are in academic centers who might be considering a similar setup. So let me get started today. First of all, most of us are familiar with the word patent cell. So the title says so, but I'm not particularly fond of that word. So first I'll take that up and then we can move on to discussing what a patent cell should be doing. As most of you are aware, typically the so-called patent cell is the point where everybody approaches when they're disclosing an invention in their organization. And that is the office that basically administers some of the patent related processes, including filing, prosecution, taking decisions on maintenance and so on and so forth, and also many other things. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. There are sometimes in some institutions, the scope is wider. People tend to put everything else on patent cells also. So we'll talk about that as well. So first we'll talk about some nomenclature and scope. What is a patent cell and what are the things that are included in the scope of a patent cell? By the way, while I'm speaking, please feel free to type your questions on the chat box. I hope to take about 35 to 40 minutes today. And then after that, we'll be open to questions as well. So the first thing to define is when you say a patent cell, is that an appropriate name? Because typically in most institutions, you will find, just give me a minute, please. I need to check. Mugdha, can you just check some of the, there are two names listed against me, so you might want to just check what's wrong.
Yeah, we'll check with the other person.
So as far as nomenclature is concerned, should it be patents or should it be more broader as intellectual property is the first question to ask. And the second is the word cell itself and what does it stand for. So let's take up the first one, which is patents or intellectual property. Typically, most organizations, academic organizations will be dealing with multiple intangible assets. By the way, I hope I don't have to emphasize why this is important. As most of you are probably aware, today, if you look at most of the valued companies of the world, the top in the S&P 500 and so on, you will find that intangible assets are the majority of their assets or what they're worth, okay, not tangible assets. So the question is, if there are intangible assets, what are the mechanisms to protect it, and also to mechanisms to formally own it, which is what the formal intellectual property rights systems of various countries provide as an opportunity, right? So intangible assets can be of multiple kinds, and different types of institutions will have different types of intangible assets. If you go to an engineering institution, you should be finding quite a lot of inventions, but you'll also find designs. You'll also find software. You might find some databases. If there is a printed circuit board, you might have layouts. So many things are possible. Similarly, in a medical research institution, you might have, besides inventions, designs, maybe of surgical tools, maybe of certain devices that you want to make. There could be software, say, for example, something which you use to, say, process data and make sense out of it. It could be an algorithm converted into a software. Or you could have databases, for example, clinical records, data sets, and so on and so forth. And you could also have some unpatentable materials like biological materials, collections, and biobanks, and so on, various different collections of different kinds. So these are all intangible assets coming out of different institutions. And invariably, you will find that most institutions will have multiple intellectual property. Of course, I'm not even talking about things like copyright and so on, which will be what will be protecting some of the writings that you do, creative writing, or even some of the software that you do as well. So one has to be, I feel that it's a better thing to position it as an office which basically administers and, if required, manages intellectual property as well. So that's the first part of the story, right? Which is the name itself, patents or intellectual property. So I prefer to call it intellectual property, and followed by the cell office group. Now, cell itself, has a very different connotation. For example, this is from the Merriam-Webster dictionary online, and one of this says it's a one-room dwelling occupied by a solitary person, such as a hermit, or single room. Well, I can tell you that patent cells are busy places where people have to come, meet each other. There'll be invention disclosure meetings. They will have to interact with inventors, service providers, and so on. So forth. It's definitely not a place which works in isolation or independently on its own, right? So intellectual property office or a group is a better word in my opinion. Now, what is the scope of activities of such an office or a group? These are three main categories that you see people talking about, but I prefer the first one being the major scope. The first is just protecting effectively the intellectual property and ensuring that you're administering the portfolio effectively of whatever patents you have. Suppose you have 20 patents, somebody has to manage that portfolio effectively. And that is a task in itself, and ensure that protection is adequate, and many other things which I'll tell you are part of the patent cell or intellectual property office are important to take care of. And that focus also requires certain kind of people who are specialized in, say, this activity in terms of just intellectual property. Then there are other things that sometimes people are asked to do, which I'm not sure necessarily that's the best thing, which is marketing, for example, finding leads, matchmaking. In the US, you will find many of these things happening in so-called tech transfer offices, right? And that is probably more suitable place to be, because it requires a different orientation than ensuring adequate protection. In many US universities, the patents activity or the intellectual property protection activity is largely outsourced. Okay, it can be done in India as well, but nonetheless, there is an activity where you have to take care of organizational interests and not necessarily just look at a very structured process, but there are strategic insights which an intellectual property office needs to provide within the organization. So there's a role beyond what, say, an IP attorney firm can do. right? So that is the primary role of an IP officer group, right? Marketing, leads, matchmaking come is the next level, and then there's deal making and contract management, which is could be part of some kind of a business development kind of group as well, but it depends from organization to organization how they manage it. In universities in US or Europe, you might find that the majority of the activity happens. There's a tech transfer office which manages number 2 and number 3 here. One is a minor activity but managed through external partners. Okay. In India, many of the patent cells are primarily focusing on the first item. So I'll focus on the first item today when we are talking about it, which is IP protection and portfolio administration. So here is an example of the scope of what, say, NCL's intellectual property group does. So I'm using that as an example. Around 2007-8, we rethought of what we should be doing with NCL. So I'm just sharing some of those principles. So the purpose here as listed is to help build and administer an IP portfolio with, of course, an emphasis on patents, because that's the large chunk of the work, for NCL as cost effectively as possible and with efficient scientist-friendly systems and processes. So this is the first part. I want to point you to a few things here. First is administer an IP portfolio. There is cost effectiveness that's important in terms of how you manage your costs. And there are many things, by the way, which you can do to reduce your costs, depending upon the choices you make and the decisions you take and how you run your workflow. The second is efficient scientist-friendly systems and processes. And I cannot underemphasize this, because at the end of the day, people have to feel happy or comfortable and not too worried about delays when they're dealing with a in-house patent cell or IP group, right? So if that doesn't happen, people might just publish it without bothering to do patent filings. No matter what, right now, there's no penalty for not filing a patent, right? And the rewards are stacked in favor of publications. So it's actually quite important that the system be efficient and scientist friendly. To oversee and manage, the second purpose here, to oversee and manage all issues relating to ownership, inventorship, sharing of information with IP potential, right? And advise on IP clauses. Now, this is a very an area where many offices forget to do enough, which is especially making sure that ownership issues are sorted out very well. And this is extremely important role, which is underemphasized in many patent cells or intellectual property groups in different institutions. So what are the focus areas here, right? What are the things which are metrics that probably a group like this should be looking at? Quantity of IP. Please remember that the data shows that organizations which have successfully commercialized IP invariably have a large pool, and 5% or so of that pool gets commercialized. So if you don't have sufficient numbers, very often you won't have enough to pick from, and it's very difficult to predict winners upfront on which IP to file and which not to file, or which one is going to be successful. There were a lot of classic examples of this, like Google, for example. Its patents were not considered particularly very important because search engine business was dominated by other players. They didn't see a clear uniqueness over there, but they were believers in the inventors, and Stanford did protect it, and it made a big difference. But it may not have been the one they thought initially would be a big deal. So quantity matters. Okay, so that is something which will be an important focus for every intellectual property group. Quality, of course, matters, and quality refers not only to the quality and the strength of the inventions, but also how well the IP is written up, how well it is protected, and so on and so forth. Okay. Beyond that, efficiency and speed, as I told you, most patent cells grapple with this problem that people don't disclose inventions just because they think that it's getting delayed. And in academic organizations, there is a lot of pressure on students to graduate, and they think that if the patent cell is going to delay their filing, they don't file at all. Okay, so that is a challenge that you will see happening. And please keep in mind that the timelines are squeezing now. So today, if you upload a paper, in 2 weeks, it might be published, right? Or even shorter period of time. Or if it goes on a preprint server, it's immediate, right? So, which means that the processes have to be such that you can quickly file, or inventors are approaching the patent cell or the IP group much earlier than normal, right? Cost optimization is another important aspect. Depending upon the choices you make, how you schedule your filing decisions of going, to going for PCT or not, or going to other countries or not, makes a huge difference. So where you do your PCT filings, all can make a big difference to your cost structure. And those are important things that a patent cell or a intellectual property group can contribute to. This is, as I told you, this next issue which I'm bringing up, which is clarity of ownership rights, is often neglected, but a very important activity. And I'll have something more to tell about that as well. So ownership rights are one of the biggest reasons, lack of clarity are one of the biggest reasons why, sometimes even commercialization gets hung up, because there's no clarity in who's going to take the decision, or the too many players involved, or there are people involved who don't understand the importance or the urgency of taking that decision of commercializing it, right? Patent administration responsibilities. There should be minimum disagreements or surprises when it comes to when you're marketing it. Somebody else is, say, marketing your IP. It should be clear who owns it, and that everything is clear in terms of ownership, and there should be no surprises. Good record keeping. This is a legal document, a patent, and therefore it's important, that good record keeping is practiced. You will need to keep records, not only sometimes of which are the papers which you're submitting to the patent office and so on, and good records and easy to access records for the people involved, the right people, inventors, or the people who are going to defend it as a patent cell. But also sometimes there could be disputes internal to the organization about inventorship. So one may need to go even further upstream in research to keep records of inventorship and so on. Increasing awareness and sensitivity in the organization, basically convincing people that filing patents is a good way for them to protect rights adequately, that others who are investors or companies are willing to invest in your own ideas. That is something which people don't realize. And there are also notions. People have notions about what a patent is for. People think that some of them have inbuilt notions of evilness built into patent system and so on. Some of these things often need to be dispelled, and that is one of the roles of a patent cell as well. An important role also is to advise, say, the director of the organization or the vice chancellor on IP related matters, and that requires a little more depth in your understanding of IP, and that means that you may need to read more, have a little bit of scholarship going on in the IP side as well, and of course compliance to various laws while you're filing IP, while you're transacting IP, and so on and so forth, right? So you'll notice here that this scope only focuses on, as I showed you before, right? It only focuses on protection and portfolio administration, not on marketing, leads, matchmaking, and so on and so forth, which is a different task and requires very often different skill sets than protecting it, right? Protection requires a lot of discipline, okay, in terms of being disciplined in how you go about with the ensuring that you're filing right, you're writing it right, you're following it up on all the reviewers the examiners comments, ensuring that grant happens, payments happen, all that. So it's a very different orientation than people who are marketing IP and technology. Okay, so here are typical workflows of IP groups or patent cells. The first, which many will be familiar with, is just that it is a receiving house for invention disclosures, right? So it's a place where invention disclosures are received and filings are planned, prosecution is overseen, and grant happens, and there are decisions to be taken on maintenance and payment of fees and so on and so forth, right? So this is one workflow, and it's an important workflow. So of this, let me just show you a slide workflow diagram of, say, only the first part, which is disclosure to filings, just to illustrate to you when I say why I'm calling it workflows and why it needs to be systematic sometimes, right? So here is, say, for example, NCL's patent workflow and some decision points, right? So there's an inventor on the left who is, say, submitting an invention disclosure. The question would be immediately after that, the IP group would call a meeting very soon, not too far, definitely not weeks later, but days later, which will basically be meant to understand the invention, document it, scope it out, and try and understand what could be potential claims that one is looking at, right? And following that, there may be a patentability assessment, which asks the question, is it patentable? This is a little easier question, in my opinion, because there's a law, there's some amount of subjectivity in it, but nonetheless, there's a law which puts down what is patentable, so you can at least go by the book and see with good, reasonable searches that whether it's patentable or not. Now, this can be done at different levels. You can do a preliminary one, or you can choose to do a more detailed one. Depends on each institution and what you think and the timelines you want to keep. If it's going to take you a lot of time, if it's only an Indian provisional filing, you may or may not want to go into it in great detail. Okay, so it may not be worth your while. The second question to ask is slightly different, which is it commercially or strategically attractive? Now, this is a different type of question, and the question is it worth filing? Right now, depending upon institutional priorities and a perception of and an understanding of institutional strategy, one may take a view on this. And this, as you can understand, is taken in a very different way than asking the question, is it patentable, right? So different people may be involved in this meeting who are essentially exploring this issue. And you can do it very fast also if you empower the people who are supposed to take those decisions. If you pass it on to a committee, it can take time as well, right? Following this, a filing decision is taken, right? If it is a no, you will explore ways to improve the case, to come back again and file it at a later date, or improve the technology, whatever it is. If it's yes, you would begin drafting, and some kind of a patent agent equivalent would start drafting a patent, and there will be a process of vetting the claims. Now, that's what even if it's this drafting the patent is done by an external partner, still I think the internal group has to vet the claims and see if it's because they have a bigger picture of what's happening for the institution, what all is happening, what could come later, and so on and so forth. What are the patents which have already been filed, what will be filed in the future? That if that picture is in mind, they can do a much better job of vetting the claims. And this is a strategic activity that the IP group performs. Okay, any kind of IP group performs, and then you can file the application. Intimation happens if the external provider is doing it, intimates the IP group or the patent cell, and goes back to the inventors, right? What I'm trying to tell you is I'm just illustrating it to you, but this is nothing new. Many institutions do it. For example, I looked up Johns Hopkins University in the US. On the right frame, you see a small box, which basically an IP group equivalent there gives this commitment that when you submit your invention disclosure, within 2 days, we'll contact you, right? Within 2 weeks, we will ensure that we'll have a discussion with you on the invention disclosure and figure out what to do, etc. And within 2 months, right, there will be a commercialization plan that they will suggest to you that could include a variety of things, including patents and so on and so forth as well. Okay, so this is something I'm telling you just because a patent group often I find people make it a very administrative activity. As I showed you, one, it's a strategic activity, and it's an important service that you're offering to your inventors. And people in such organizations have to have a service orientation of delivering high quality services to ensure that inventions are protected, right? And timelines are quite important if you want to ensure higher volumes and so on. So let me go back a little here and come back to the next workflow. The second workflow is ownership, rights, and responsibilities. If you're in this, you're essentially ensuring who owns the IP, right? And who has rights to exploit it, and maybe issues like inventorship and so on and so forth, right? That has to be clear. Now, as I'll explain to you, the ownership if you're is determined by the agreements and the policies. Okay, so you have to have policies in place, and you have to have agreements if to define those. And very often, if you're dealing with external partners, there will be agreements such as MTAs, material transfer agreements, joint development agreements, or joint invention administration agreements that you may end up signing as well. The third workflow, I'll come back to this again, but third workflow is portfolio planning and cost management. So imagine if you had 100 patents, okay, as say an IIT may have, they may need to decide which ones to keep, how long, do they want to build a cluster around a particular topic, is there a strategic intent over there, and so on and so forth, right? So that is a different process. And that may require use of some amount of data management tools, right? Not necessarily formal software, but even good Excel sheet really used to manage all the data carefully. The data and records management and correspondence is another activity. Many larger IP offices will have an administrator who is responsible for this, the data and records management and correspondences. Correspondences could even include things like, for example, documents assigning patents, right? Where inventors have to sign documents which tell that so and so institution owns it, and that those go on the records. And every time you file in a foreign country, you may need to do it again and again, which means that you need to stay on top of the correspondence as well, right? Then there is awareness, training and scouting for inventions and other IP. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but as awareness definitely is important, but training in different ways also plays a role. And we used to also do some IP active scouting for inventions, because sometimes people don't realize that they're sitting on an inventor, and you need to pull it out and say, yeah, this looks like a patentable invention, do something about it, right? Okay. Beyond that, engaging external service providers and consultants, and therefore managing a call to engage them and to do contract management for those external service providers. So this is another office responsibility, where periodically you will engage consultants or impanel a bunch of people to attorney firms to say maybe support you or other service providers, and manage their contracts as well, right? And besides that, last, which I told before also, is advice to the leadership team on IP matters, especially in clauses in agreements which might come from time to time, and ensuring that there's compliance to both agreements and the law, right? Okay, so this I have shown you. I'll talk a little bit about agreements and contract shaping ownership. The first and most important one is what every staff or employee signs, which is the employment contract. The employment contract, be it regular or temporary, have IP clauses. If they don't have, you should be putting it into your organization's IP, into the employment contracts. IP clauses should be there. The second is the category of students. If you have students in your organization, if they are paid, like fellowships, scholarship agreements might have such clauses. If not, it depends upon the institution's policy. In many universities abroad, you will find that the undergrad students who are paying their way own their IP, okay? Whereas the people who are, say, PhD students who might have a fellowship, scholarship, might be assigning their IP to the host institute, to the university. and especially if substantial use of resources has happened. So there are different agreements which decide that, and what kind of a student you are also matters. Consultants, for example, if your organization is engaging consultants, you should have consulting agreements which have IP clauses in them. Visiting students is an important category. Nowadays, there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration, and a lot is happening across different countries, not only in organizations within India. So when the students are visiting or there's a collaboration, you may need to sign some kind of an IP agreement with people who are joining that organization. Otherwise, there can be a lot of conflicts and disputes at a later stage. So it's better to do it upfront. If some of you have seen international universities inviting, say, postdocs or some fellows from other countries, you might have also seen that they send a document which the fellows have to sign, which basically talks about the intellectual property and who owns it and so on and so forth, depending upon who is funding it, before they even leave for that institution for a postdoc. Okay. Academic collaborations, the scope of IP will be defined by the collaboration agreement or the MOU. And industry collaborations very often will have some joint development agreements or sponsored research agreements, which will define the IP clauses as well. Now, in all of this, a lot of structuring happens in terms of how you want to keep it, and there's a lot of variation possible. It's a mistake to try and cut, paste, and copy the same clauses across different cases, because very often there's a lot of you can work with a variety of different possibilities, and there are ways to close agreements by suggesting suitable clauses. So good learning and background for IP office is to look at clauses from different agreements and see what are the options you can create in a given situation, right? And there can be agreements for protecting against misuse, like a confidentiality agreement or a non-disclosure agreement or a material transfer agreement and so on. There are many such drafts available online, so I won't go into all these details, but you can please Google and you should be able to find many from different places around the world. And there are some which many universities have agreed to use as a standard template. For example, the MTA, then you'll find a template available which several universities agreed on as well for different types of materials. So you can use some of these freely. Typical IP group or a patent cell consists of some of these parts, which I'm trying to list here. Let me start with the first one, which is the IP policy itself, right? And IP policy, you will hear, that's a separate talk itself, but let me give you a few pointers about it. The IP policy sets out the guiding principles of the organization and why IP is important to them. It sets out the ownership principles. It sets out the exploitation principles as well, in terms of how it can be exploited and so on and so forth. And it may also have some other aspects, which sometimes may be in a guidelines document and not a policy document. So I won't go into that. One of my colleagues can talk about that separately another day. But team is another important aspect. This core team, as I told you, can choose to do a strategic function rather than just an office that is playing an administrative role. So it's possible to play a strategic role when you're talking about an IP group, which there's a core team which does it. Beyond that, there will be a decision-making process. That is, somebody has to take a decision on actions and investments, right? And that could be an individual or a committee. If you empower an individual in an organization, decisions could be fast, but there are many organizations which go with committees. And when they do with committees, there are some pros and cons, which I will talk briefly about. Then the budget. Question is, does the IP group or the patent cell have a budget, or is it expected of an inventor to arrange it, right? And of course, the former is preferable, right? You might have external service providers or attorney firms. So these are all pieces of the puzzle. You may engage with multiple attorney firms. You might have empaneled a bunch of attorney firms, or you might work with one of them. And as far as infra goes, an office and a meeting room is quite important, because invention disclosure meetings, if you have a reasonably prolific organization, you will have a lot of meetings happening, not only for invention disclosures, but for office actions, discussions with inventors, and so on and so forth. So a meeting room is quite important, which needs to be relatively private. It can't be an open area. And you may need to invite sometimes external service providers into that meeting as well, depending upon what your process is. There will be workflows and formats. I'll be talking about workflows, different workflows. So this is and each workflow, to make it happen, there'll be different forms or different documents which will allow you to move to the next stage. There'll be some assessments or reports which you might create, decision support reports, like I told you about patentability, or about assessing attractiveness, or there may be others also from time to time, which an IP group or a patent cell may be asked to provide. There'll be a database of IP assets. So if you have 100 or 200 patents to deal with, you should have a database with some amount of portfolio analysis tools. For example, if you want to decide that, look, I want to have a portfolio which is focused on, say, gene editing, right? Then you should be able to say, how many assets do you have which are related to gene editing? And if a partner, industry partner, comes and asks you, okay, tell us what all you have in this space, you should be able to provide that and say, this is what you have done, and so on and so forth. And this, besides licensing opportunities, this also opens up opportunities for sponsored research and various other collaborations, because you have to have some base on the field and something to show to be a credible player in that field as well. And finally, you may have access to, you may need to know, you may need to search IP databases. Many of the ones which are available from patent offices are free of cost. You can access them freely, and you can do much of your searches, Google patents, and so on and so forth. But there are also proprietary databases which are available, which will allow you a lot more analytics, a little bit saves you time. There's some analytics you cannot easily do in each of these other free patent databases. So these are the components of a typical IP group and patent cell, and each of this you need to take. So let me take a few for the discussion, and then we can take it ahead. The team itself, in an ideal IP group or patent cell, as I told you, it's a disciplined activity. It needs to be done on time. It needs to be run systematically. One needs to ensure that everything is documented well, and so on and so forth. But besides that, there is also more. One important trait of people in these teams is the ability to understand and document an invention. When an inventor is describing an invention, he may go into various aspects of the science, may describe mechanisms, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, you need to pull out what was the problem that was solved and how it was done. And that's the heart of the invention, right? And that is an important trait. And you have to visualize some draft claims. So you need to conceptualize certain draft claims which you can use for this purpose. You also need to be able to strategically design claims, right? So suppose if your organization is interested in a certain aspect, say fuel cells, and wants to focus on, say, building a portfolio around certain materials required for fuel cells, you need to think through what are the claims which would be valuable for your organization, and also in the context of previous filings and future filings, you need to visualize those claims, because you may end up anticipating sometimes future inventions unnecessarily. So you need to limit those, but at the same time, you need to cover the scope broadly, right? So this is a challenging task, not trivial, and it also requires considerable judgment and experience. You also need to have the ability to gauge if the case has novelty and non-obviousness, and if the case is strong for that, and advise how it can be strengthened. An understanding of the law and procedures and terminologies of the patent office is quite important. Basically, what happens is, if the patent office sends you a note which says, please do X, Y, Z, you need to understand what that means, right? If it says, there's a unity of invention problem, you need to know and explain it or understand it in simple words, because your inventors will not, right? And then convert it into actionable items. So if you need to, decide on prioritization of certain claims first, breaking it up into two patents because the examiner won't allow it, or whatever it is, those have to be explained, and it cannot be assumed that the inventor will understand it. And very often inventors get turned off by the legalese in those documents. You need to convert it into simple language. You also need to sometimes prepare some support documents, decision support documents, and provide recommendations, right? So if there is a particular invention, and let's say that the invention is weak on what is called non-obviousness. So there's a novel element to it, but there is a problem with non-obviousness. That means the examiner may argue for non-obviousness. You may need to dig a little deeper, such that the inventor puts out information which clearly articulates what is non-obvious. That means there is this inventive step that happened which was unanticipated, and that could come out through data by illustrating, say, a case where you would expect it would happen but it doesn't happen. But when you do it the way the inventor has done it, it happens. That is a good way to, say, provide information on non-obviousness, right? So the decision support documents which clearly articulate whether, this is a weakness here, and provide recommendations, can also be quite helpful. Overall, as a broader team in innovation management, you need to have people who are trained in sciences and engineering, and in the IP groups, you need to have basically a background in intellectual property law and practice. So this right-hand side of this slide is what you need to do. The other activities I told you, which are out of scope of the IP group activities, for example, I told you about creating leads, marketing, and so on and so forth, and being able to do deals, is a little more tilted towards this side of the activity, which is people who are little, who can think of it managerially and also strategically in terms of what to do with it and who would be interested, present a case, a value proposition, and so on and so forth, evaluate what value it has, and market it, right? So these are a little bit more closer to what you understand as management in common language, right? So this is something which the team needs to have. As far as the decision-making authority is concerned, many organizations in India use committees, right? But you can have a single person also authorized to take decisions. And even if you can create the right empowerment structure, somebody can do it. It can be faster, but it may or may not be suitable for every organization. You may need to figure that out depending upon each organization. Now, that committee can sometimes be very helpful, sometimes be a bottleneck. So let me tell you a few pointers there. First of all, please ensure that the committee members understand IPR and have read the policy. Most of the committee members in academic organizations are typically academics, and they do understand science, they do understand the process of research, and traditionally, the process of publications and so on and so forth. One common mistake is to think that patents are very comparable to publications. It is not, right? A simple example I must tell you is that, for example, in a patent, you might state, here is a problem, here is a solution, and this problem is solved by this solution. But the mechanistic details may not be important, how it does it, right? Whereas in a publication, you might focus on the mechanistic details. Now, if the committee members start focusing on the wrong things, you might be actually wasting your opportunity to file certain patents and so on and so forth. Also, they should have read the policy, IP policy, and understand a little bit about intellectual property laws and so on. For example, that, the core to patent law is what is patentable, which is, that it has to be novel, non-obvious, useful, and that it should, meet it should basically not get excluded out by the law, right? So that has to be understood. So if not, you have to train them for it. And ensure also that the committee has a supportive and positive tone. Very often we find inventors who are turned off by the negativity of the committees, and then they don't come back to again submit invention disclosures. Ensure also that the committee has sensitivity to time, deadlines, and so on and so forth. They're willing to put some time in. Besides this, also the decision making process can be as structured as possible to be objective. For example, novelty can be fairly objective, but the non-obviousness is a little bit of a more subjective element, but still you can structure it. It's not as subjective as a decision to say this is important or not, right? This is an important science or not. That's a very subjective matter, right? But objectivity can be brought in here. And of course, provide supporting decision support documents. For example, if the IP group or the patent cell provides a supporting document to the decision makers, it's a lot easier for them to do. For example, a comment on novelty, a comment on non-obviousness or usefulness, and so forth, right? So that is that speeds up things. Otherwise, committees can be a significant reason for delays, and very often they result in poor bottlenecks in the workflow, right? Budgets. About budgets, the typical cost items for IP groups and patent cells are these. First of all, just the cost of protecting it, which could be the cost of drafting, filing, prosecution, and so on and so forth. Like for example, an attorney's cost. If you're doing it in-house, then it may not be as much. The statutory fees for filing and examination. Just to give you a sense of the numbers, statutory fees in India might be as low as 8,000 rupees, let us say, right? It's not much, okay? Whereas the drafting, filing, prosecution service may cost you 60, 70, 80,000, 1 lakh as well. So you must keep in mind that, if you could file yourself with statutory fees, it's still possible. It's not that it's not possible. You may not do the best job, but it's possible and to file it in fairly low cost. And there can be other costs like translation costs and maintenance fees comes up later after grant, and maintenance fees are typically large and keeps increasing as the patent keeps getting older and older and you hold on to it. So these are some costs to keep in mind. Of course, the HR and HR costs, I mean, human resource cost and also engaging specialized consultants is a cost, but also software and databases as required, right? Which you need to factor in. This need not be very expensive formal software. You can do with for many people, many institutions, the portfolio may not be very large, so they may be able to manage with cheaper sources. So largely your major cost is going to be drafting, filing, prosecution, IP attorney costs, okay, and your own overheads as an organization. Now, just one point I wanted to leave you with is, if an organization wants inventors to file more patents, then that organization should create a separate pool of funds for IP costs and not expect the researchers to arrange money for the IP costs. So in many institutions, you've seen the PI is trying to use his own budget, her own budget, or run around trying to figure out how to fund it. This is not an optimal way to do it, right? It's much better if the organization allocates certain funds for this activity as well. Events is another important activity that any IP group or patent cell needs to do. One set of them are about awareness and inspiration. When people see role models, when they see who have successfully done it or gained something out of an activity in patenting or in protecting any IP, that is something which is worth showing. The other is also workshops for training students. Examples could be doing patent searches, how to spot an invention. That's an important thing which many people don't do, and many scientists and students don't realize that they are sitting on an invention. How to come up with inventive ideas. We are hoping to run one session on this in the only one theme series. So hopefully some of you will get to hear that. And a primer on, say, patents for researchers. So you will see some of these especially the first one and the fourth one, very commonly in many universities around the world. And that's what, and even academies like including, for example, the associations of different scientists, they also run such primers and so on and so forth. Besides that, there need to be opportunities for the IP group or the patent cells to scout for potential inventions. And this, my colleagues in IP group and patent set did very well by actually scouting, say, in the internal science day poster sessions, right, as an example. Besides that, there can also be some events which are recognizing or celebrating inventors in the organization. This depends, of course, on how much support the leadership provides. But I've seen some very nice events, say, for example, Mahindra's, which runs an annual Inventors Day. GE, for example, has a very nice wall of inventors celebrating prolific inventors in the organization as well. So these kind of things motivate people, make it interesting to and worthwhile to be inventors in that organization. Regarding external service providers, these are some roles that external service providers play. The first one is drafting, filing, prosecution. And typically these are IP attorney firms who might be doing it for you, unless it's done in-house. By the way, some institutions do it. CSIR does the India ones in-house. Okay. The decision support documents, you might need, say, for example, a patentability assessment, and somebody might be doing it for you. Right now, for example, our TechX team has an analytics activity in Venture Center, which provides some of these decision support documents as well. Besides that, there might be providers who might be doing training of your staff. There might also be some which are research planning reports, which inventors might need or researchers might need either prior to starting a piece of work or during while carrying out a piece of work. For example, the patent landscape or the freedom to operate or white space analysis to find gaps in the technology landscape where they can operate and where they will not step on somebody else's patents. So these are some things which you can leverage external service providers for. You may need some or not, depending upon your own organization as well. And there are many available, and you can choose from them as per your need. The need for attorneys, a quick word. See, they bring in considerable experience in drafting, filing, prosecutions. Okay, and larger attorney firms can afford to also have industry-specific specialists. So it's good to utilize their help depending upon your budget and your ability to engage them. Certain jurisdictions also, like in other countries, might require that you do filings, prosecution by a qualified attorney. So you may need to look at those rules and laws as well. And between attorney firms and their foreign affiliates, you do get specialist advice for each jurisdiction. Just to give you a quick example, certain types of claims are not allowed in India, like a method of use claim, right? Whereas you can write a method of use claim in the US. Now, when you're going from India through the US, if your attorney is told to consider rewriting some of those claims, they may add that claim, right? So, because that law allows it, right? So you may need to think through and leverage attorneys accordingly, depending upon what your need is, what your budget is, and so on, so forth. Inventors may not have the depth of knowledge of different patent laws. Inventors also will not have the time to learn all this or handle the logistics of multiple countries. So you may end up with working with patent attorney firms for that case, right? Besides this, we often find that many organizations don't track carefully the deadlines. So invariably, you'll find that people missing deadlines, not following up on within the timelines for when examination reports come in and they have to respond and so on. So somebody who's a professional who is doing it in a systematic manner is useful. And of course, in litigations, you have no choice but to have attorneys as well. Regarding portfolio and cost management, there are some important decisions to be taken to manage your portfolios and costs. I'm just going to be very brief. One is decisions on should we file, first of all. Next, where should we file, the scope of filing, how much will it cost. Cost can depend also on number of claims that you have and so on and so forth. So you can optimize many of those things. Maintenance decisions and how much will it cost. As I told you, maintenance costs are the most expensive part of the statutory costs that you pay for maintaining a patent, right? And then what to keep and what to let go. You may want to have some bunch of patents in a given area because that is your strong area. You might want to think about complementarity between one set of patents and another set of patents. You may want to think about strategic versus commercial interests. So for example, something which is immediately of interest to industry comes under commercial interest. Something which you think will be of interest 5 years down the road and you need to be prepared might come under strategic interest, right? So you might want to plan that out. And there are many domains like that where, after 5 years, there's a lot of interest. Whereas by then, if you have not created your portfolio, you're too late, right? So these are some things to consider as well. The final slide I'm going to talk briefly about is just about how to increase your submissions if you're running a patent office, right? If you're running an IP office in your institution, this will be one of your key metrics, number of invention disclosures and number of patents filed. So first thing, a few pointers. Do not ask inventors to find their own funds for patenting costs. If you do that, that itself creates a barrier. Reduce time spent by inventors on drafting, answering queries, clarifications, etc. As I told you, this is not necessarily a highest priority item for many inventors. So if it can be simplified for them, they are more likely to get more invention disclosures. Reduce barriers and delays to publications, presentations to the minimum. It's very important to do this. And increasingly, as the time to publication decreases considerably, you need to speed it up. But besides that, you can also teach people to start the process of filing, submitting an invention disclosure early, because what you need for a patent is very different from what you need for a publication. You may have all the information upfront, as people might start doing mechanistic studies for the detailed data for their publications, right? That can take time. So you can even think of 6 months before a publication that could have been done. So it's a matter of educating people to do that. Reducing the bureaucracy and paperwork and delays in decision-making, committees, hierarchy, and empowering inventors. Don't insult inventors saying that the invention is no good. That doesn't help in decision-making processes. Awareness and removing the fear of the unknown, removing myths. People have myths in their mind about how the patent system works. For example, as I told you, the cost of Indian filing statutories is 8,000 rupees. People think it costs a bomb. It doesn't if you're filing it yourself. Or the fact that people confuse the fact that you have a patent with what you do with it, right? You can always have a patent, get the credit of being the inventor. And if you want to give it away, that's up to you, right? It is not necessary. It has got nothing to do with the licensing terms that you follow when you're commercializing, irrespective of your ideological beliefs. It's just a matter of protecting it. And as I said, nobody will invest if you don't have protection, right? High level support at institutional level is very important. A commitment to patents and IP and carrot and stick kind of a policy. Sometimes some senior leaders make stray comments on, so for example, saying that this is of not much value, because they don't understand that you need to find 100 to get 5 successful ones. They think it's a wasteful activity. Sometimes some of them think that it's just a resume padding activity. All these are myths and misconceptions which high level support needs to dispel in order for people to file patents and consider it a useful activity rather than a wasted activity. Inventors should also should not have to deal with a lot of IP jargon and legal processes. And that's the interface that many of the IP group and patent offices will have to play a role in. And finally, sincere and authoritative efforts to license and commercialize. At the end of the day, most scientists who are inventing and who are filing patents will want to see their ideas in use. Okay. the money is a secondary aspect. The first aspect is it should be put to use, right? And if it is lying idle and not put to use, that is a worry. So I'm not saying that the IP group or the patent cell needs to do it necessarily, but the organization has to have a process for commercialization. And that becomes an important aspect in order to motivate people to file some of these patents. And efforts, right, may be successful or not, but sincere efforts nonetheless. So I think with that, I'm done. Thank you very much. This is the contact information for our tech transfer office at Venture Center, which is responsible especially for the West Zone. All this content is available online on our on a YouTube channel as well. Many such talks, so you're free to use that. There should be a link on techx.in as well. So thank you very much. I'll stop here and over to questions, please. So I'll be happy to take some questions now.
So I think there was one in the chat box which talked about incentives for students from royalty.
Yeah. So I think Sharvari, when you put the link in, put it with the HTTP so that it's a direct clickable link. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So let's continue with this first. Sorry, where was the question, please? Has it come to you or is it on the chat box?
It's on the chat box. It's some time back. I'll just read it out for you maybe.
Yeah. So the policies, the IP policy also has terms which says, you know, what is the revenue sharing model of the organization, or it could be in another document, which will be the technology commercialization policy. And it depends on those policies. Typically, some institutions, as you might be aware, most companies do not have a policy of sharing any such revenues, but they may have some rewards for inventors. Whereas organizations as academic and research organizations and not-for-profit organizations have some policies of sharing revenues, right? That is possible and does happen. You can and different organizations list out their policies. So if you go online, you will find that out. Some of them will first cover their cost of filing patents and so on and so forth, and then have a distribution mechanism. And in that, typically all inventors are treated at par, okay, whether they are student or staff and so on and so forth. But an institution can have different policies. So you need to go and look up that policies in terms of what your institution says and what has been approved by the governing council of your institution, right? So I hope that answers your question. I think Shankar Rao has asked that question. So it is possible to share revenues with all the inventors. But let me alert you that the odds of a patent making significant revenues are fairly low. Okay, so most inventors do it because they want to find ways to take it to market first, and in that, how many will succeed depends not only on the quality of the invention, but depends on who is commercializing it, what are the barriers for commercialization, how investment happens, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if you're a student, that should not, your motivation should not be, in my opinion, it's fair to have a policy which gets revenues, but that should not be your primary motivation for doing your work. Okay, in which case you'll not end up doing work with a significant impact. Okay, and aiming for the right things in terms of getting it to market. Any other questions, Mugdha?
Yeah, there's one more, but before we take that, let me alert everyone. The feedback link is there in the chat box. Please do use that to give your feedback for the talk. The next question is from Gautam Kulsi, and he wants to know, are there any rules or regulations for setting up IPR cell in incubation center?
Yeah, there are no rules or regulations. There are only guidelines, right? For example, the Ministry of Higher Education or the ones which governs many academic institutions, has put out certain guidelines. Okay, but it is finally up to the institution to decide, right? And the governing body of the institution has to approve policies, and convert those policies will get converted into institutional processes. For example, that, you know, there will be offices, there will be a workflow, there will be people who will take decisions. All that is rolled out, and then people follow that, right? So there are this is not something which they will get into. I mean, this will not be laid out as a law. Okay, this is something for every organization to take a view on. There are best practices which are known also from various institutions around the world. So that's also happened. For example, I know that many of the IITs borrowed some of their guidelines from leading institutions, universities around the world, and try to pick up some of the best practices. And depending upon each of their models, they have framed their own policies. Right?
A related question, how many IPR in an organization is large enough for having an IPR cell?
Huh. Okay, so see, the IPR cell itself, if you have taken a decision to promote intellectual property in your organization, and if you even have one inventor, it's your job as an organization to create mechanisms to file patents, protect it, and so on and so forth, right? So even if it's a one member, or it is somebody who is doing part-time, that also might work for very, very small organizations. But you know, as your if you want to start somewhere, you have to at least identify one person who is responsible for that activity. Maybe not full-time, but at least part-time. As it grows, you will see that the volumes will go up considerably. Just as a thumb rule, you know, I would think that if you have one case manager or one person who is dealing with some of these things, they should be able to handle, I think about, if the scope is limited to only protection and portfolio management and not the rest, they should be able to handle about 20 filings a year. Okay, at least, right? So you can take that as a rough thumb rule and work with that, right? And then scale it up and down depending upon what you want to do. So it's a matter of how many case managers you want to have, right? Any other questions?
Yeah, just one more. Is it advisable then to create a innovation management cell before IPR cell?
No, you need to have masala first before you make food, right? You need to have ingredients. If you don't have any ingredients, it is very difficult to commercialize anything. So I think creating a culture of filing and protecting patents comes first. It is important to do that. You can, of course, be commercializing know-how and so on. So there can be activities where you have a tech transfer office which is focusing on just know-how without any intellectual property. That is possible, in which case that depends upon the organizational philosophy and policies as well. There can be organizations which just say that you can have a policy which says that we don't care about IP. It's up to you as an organization. I don't necessarily think it's a good thing, but that's also possible.
Are you okay to take one last one, Dr.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. Go ahead.
What are the factors or parameters to consider to frame a policy generally to begin with for a very new adopting organization?
Yes. So anytime you define a policy, you always do it in the context of the organizational mission and its policy, right? So that is the first thing to keep in mind. So you'll find universities in the US which have policies which will reflect their institutional guiding principles. So for example, MIT's primary role is teaching and dissemination of knowledge, right? So everything else becomes secondary to that, right? So you will find in their policy a statement which will say that we will file patents, but not at the cost of dissemination or teaching. Okay. So in that context, they're not very fond of obviously trade secrets, right? An organization which is comfortable with trade secrets may not want to disseminate that information easily, right? So its first thing is it's always in the context of organizational policies and principles. The second aspect is about, so you first write down your guiding principles, what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do as an organization, and those will be your priorities, and then you can roll it down as well. There are a lot of good practices and learnings available on many of these things. For example, ownership. The current practice in most organizations and the best practice is considered to be ownership with the organization instead of the inventors. Okay. And that came through learning from many different institutions who tried both of them out and decided that, you know, it's a lot better to go with the organization owning it. There's less confusion, there's less bickering, and so on and so forth. So these are some things which you need to consider when you are doing drafting it. There's a separate talk on policy, so I don't want to talk about all of that here, but Mahesh, I'll be happy to share some information with you separately.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Premnath. There are no more questions in the chat box right now. There was a raised hand. Dr. Chakravarti wanted to ask, you can unmute yourself. Are you able to unmute yourself? We have request you to unmute.
Okay, yeah, I am audible.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Good evening, Dr. Premnath.
Yeah, hello, Dr.
So the thing is that as we see in most of our R&D or academic organizations, usually the patents are not aligned with the market at all. Okay, and for that reason, quite often the patents are prepared, but the technologies are prepared, but which could be aligned with the market. Probably provided some orientation was done while developing the technology, right? Like you do in an incubation center. We always do that in incubation center, what is called in the mentoring, right? So now the question is, there is an academic organization or purely in academic research which is not having incubation center. In that case, shouldn't there be some innovation management cell which provides that type of mentoring before development of the technology?
Yeah,
so that it meets the physical success factors to begin with. Like before it reaches to the bench or the workbench, the person knows with clear idea that okay, this is what I have to meet, and then my technology will be successful. What do you say?
Yeah. So what you are saying is right for technology translation. Okay. But at the point of conception, okay, you need to be a little more careful. It's well known that it's very difficult to spot winners upfront. That includes those which are aligned to the market. Okay. So let's take an example. So for example, the patent for the mRNA modification, which just won the Nobel Prize, the invention and discovery won the Nobel Prize. But but when it was done, the original work, right, in 2005, right, it was not seen as interesting from a market point of view. Okay. So, but fortunately, there was a patent which was filed. Okay. But unfortunately, University of Pennsylvania gave it away cheap. Okay. But the point I'm trying to make here is that in especially breakthrough ideas and ideas which are challenging a market space, are going to disrupt a market space, you need to be careful in terms of trying to seek too much alignment to the current market. Okay. Whereas as you advance the technology, right, then increasingly you look at market needs and so on and so forth. But sometimes it is important that when you're at a patent stage, right, you may choose to look at things which you are not able to anticipate the entire entire scope of what it's going to disrupt. Okay. So
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so it's a
a good innovation management team, I think.
Yeah.
A good innovation manager or management team, they will be able to foresee in future that, okay, it is not having market potential now, but it may have market potential maybe in 10 or 15 years ahead, right? So some assessment. See, for example, in my case, I got so many different types of technologies for commercialization, and when we checked in the market, so afterwards, customers say, yeah, why did you develop the technology? Actually, it was not required, and it has been patented long back. And
so you can, I mean, I do agree that you need to create those capabilities of gauging innovation, but I just wanted to suggest that you may want to take it with a pinch of salt. Okay. Do it, but do it with caution.
Like in a BIG grant. For example, BIG grant, after BIG grant, we are like filing patent, correct. But before BIG grant, a lot of strategic planning, a lot of due deliberation from different angles is done. And it is necessary, correct.
Okay,
right.
So I think
same way, but when it is not, but then again, BIG is basically going for entrepreneurship development, right? But when it is not going for entrepreneurship development, when it is a pure R&D, like organizational research, in that case also, at least that type of deliberations, don't you think it will be useful or important?
No, I agree that it is useful and important, but I was only cautioning you that we have to do it with a little bit more caution and good judgment.
Of course,
which we have to develop as innovation managers. Yeah. Okay. So I think I have to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But thanks for your questions also. And I hope this was useful for all of you. So thank you. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Mugdha.
Thank you, Dr. Premnath, for this wonderful session. Let me alert everyone about the feedback link once again.
You may want to keep your video on.
And sorry?
You may want to keep your video on while you close.
Yeah. So the feedback link is in the chat box. And our next session in this series is now going to happen on Tuesday, 7th of November, and not immediately 2 Tuesdays. So the next Tuesday is off, of course, with Dussehra coming up. So happy festivities to all of you. And again, the Tuesday after that is not going to be a talk, but we will meet again on the first Tuesday of November, that is 7th of November at 4 o'clock with our next talk. So meet you also. Thank you.